Hey, what's going on everybody? My name is Christian and I'm a travel and adventure photographer living in Bali. The most powerful tool in my camera bag is probably a wide angle lens like this 16 to 35 millimeter. Other than perhaps a drone, there is, in my opinion, not another single photographic piece of equipment that can help you create more jaw-dropping and more impactful photos than you can do with this wide-angle lens. So without further ado, here are my do's and don'ts in wide-angle photography coming up. If you're anything like me, grand landscapes and big epic vistas gets your blood flowing. And if you really want to be able to capture the full scale of these epic landscapes, there's no really way around that you need to go and try out a wide angle lens. I have a 16 to 35 right now. Earlier I had an even wider lens. I will get into that later. So if you haven't tried going really wide before and it's on the top of your wish list of lenses to buy, or you already own a wide angle lens but you're not sure how to use it, then this is the video for you. I've simply just always loved to shoot very wide and try to get multiple elements into the frame and make unique photos full of storytelling. But I wasn't always very good at it. And that's why I wanted to make this video where I will break down 4 things you need to know to get the most out of your wide angle lens. So you can avoid making boring photos like these, that even if captured in both iconic and epic locations, the photos are not iconic or epic in any way. But this just goes to show that if you're lazy when using your wide angle lens, you will come away with some very disappointing results. Like this photo of a waterfall in Iceland. Even though this photo is shot on a 14mm lens, it's heavily unbalanced and I'm not incorporating any of the 4 tips I'm going to talk about in this video. The focal point is unclear, or at least it is placed too much to the right in the frame. There's no foreground to create any kind of depth. It's very obvious that I didn't have a clear ambition or idea before clicking the shutter, and I didn't do much of an effort to enhance the storytelling by either placing a person or get very low to the water and maybe try a long exposure. So don't be lazy in your landscape photography, or you will end up with unfocused photos that stands no chance of grabbing anyone's attention. Look at these clouds, they are so epic and I just totally screwed it up. The light is a little boring, but I could have worked so much more on my composition here. Maybe go down to the rocks you can see in the lower right of the photo and try to find a foreground or just something that would make this more interesting than just a boring green field of grass. I have to quote the old saying that a good view is not necessarily a good photo. Another example, I could have maybe played around with some of these rocks in the foreground. I could have maybe switched to portrait mode and used these dark rocks as to my advantage and make this photo more interesting. Right now it's flat. All the elements in the photo is almost the same distance from the camera, and that very rarely leads to an interesting composition. So what is a wide angle lens actually? The most common definition of a wide angle lens is a lens that is wider than 35 millimeters. So that means that everything above 35, 50, 85, 100, 200, that is not a wide angle lens, but everything below 35 is a wide angle lens. If you ever wondered why camera lenses are measured in millimeters, let me try to explain real quickly. The focal length of a lens is the distance between the image sensor and the lens when the subject is in focus. Millimeters seems to be the appropriate unit of measurement for subjects in this size range. Therefore, it is stated in millimeters. A 24mm, for example, would be a good choice, but in my opinion you can benefit so much from going even wider and preferably all the way down to a 16mm. 16mm equals to 107 degrees on the diagonal side, and that's a pretty wide field of view and a lot of space in the frame for you to fill with interesting content. So using a wide angle lens gives you a whole lot of possibilities, but you should also be aware of a few downsides to using a wide angle lens. Too much dead space or too many conflicting elements can totally ruin your photos if not used with purpose and attention to detail. It's all too easy to end up with flat and boring photos as we just saw. You can of course also go even wider and go for a zoom lens like a 12 to 24 millimeter or a 14 to 24 millimeter. But one thing to keep in mind here is that if you're using filters in your photography, it is worth mentioning that these ultra wide angle lenses, they come with a very bulky front element, meaning you will have to use a big filter system. I personally prefer the much smaller screw-on filters, and that's why I find the 16 to 35 millimeter the optimal choice for a reasonably lightweight and good quality wide angle zoom lens. I very rarely find myself in situations where I would want to have a wider field of view, but for instance in this huge location in the Faroe Islands, the landscape is simply so big that even at 16 millimeter you wish for just a bit more. As you will notice, there is a few shots in this video taken with the legendary Nikkor 14 to 24, and that would be a perfect lens at this location. But I sold it because I found it to be way too heavy for hiking and way too bulky for my screw-on filters. And all this leads to my first tip, which is get a clear focal point. Shooting very wide means you can include a lot of things in your frame, and that makes it even more important to fill the frame with objects that benefit the photo. Your main point of interest has to be very obvious. In landscape photography, this often means a big and interesting natural feature like a mountain or a waterfall. A good example of a simple yet powerful photo is this one from Iceland of the glacier. There's not much else going on in the frame, but if the focal point is unique, it is more than enough to make a strong composition. The same goes for this iconic landscape in the Faroe Islands. You've probably seen tons of photos from this location, but I would still recommend everyone to go there. There's a very clear focal point, so even though there's lots of things going on, you're not in doubt about what is the focal point, what's the reason why I took a photo in this location. This is also true for this rather simplistic shot of this very unique location in the north of Iceland. This sea stack is called Vitsekur. The idea with the long exposure here was that if I blurred out the ocean, it would make the black sand beach in the foreground and the main object, the focal point of the photo, the sea stack, stand more out, and I think I managed to do that in this photo. Another shot from the Faroe Islands where there's a very, very clear focal point. It's the same location as the one we saw earlier where I didn't have enough millimeters to go wide enough. This evening I was very lucky with the conditions. You had all these clouds rolling over the island, and with a long exposure of actually 30 seconds, I was able to catch this beautiful phenomena. Also in this shot, we're back in Iceland. I got really low again to get the reflection in the receding water on the beach, and it's almost too clear what the focal point is, and there's almost nothing else in the photo, but sometimes that just really work. As long as you have a very clear focal point, you can go really simple in your compositions. Another good example of a clear focal point is this, a beautiful otherworldly location where I decided to put an old dead tree in the foreground, and then you can still see the rest of the location in the background. In this way I made the tree the focal point, but you're also allowed to let your eyes wander to the background and wonder what is going on down there. Why is the lake that color? What is the smoke? What is going on with the volcano in the left side, and so forth. And this whole talk actually leads me to tip number 2, which is include a foreground. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to include a foreground when you use a wide-angle lens. The reason you want to do that is because a wide-angle lens is essentially designed to stretch and distort the perspective. So you have to include at least a foreground to separate your focal point from the rest of the photo. A good example of adding layers to a scene is this photo from the top of Rinjani. In the very near foreground you have the tall grass that I deliberately let in to create this depth. Then you have the middle ground where Jackson is standing, and then another middle ground, which is the lake, and perhaps even the little volcano in the middle of the lake. And then you have the background, which is actually just the crater encircling around the top of the volcano. And then you have a few clouds, stuff like that coming in. But that's all the small details to create this 3D effect into the photo, where you feel like you're almost falling into the scene. Another dramatic location in Iceland is this same day as the reflection we saw earlier. This is Stuxness. The focal point here is clearly the mountain range. You simply don't come to this location to photograph the foreground or the beach itself. Of course, I wanted to include some foreground to make it more interesting and to give some depth to the photo. Another example here is in Switzerland. The light is rubbish, I know, but bear over with me. I deliberately got really low in this photo to include some of these yellow flowers, because by introducing the flowers you get a foreground and you get the lake in the middle ground and you have the mountains as the background, and in that way your eyes can sort of travel through the photo and get this 3D effect. Tip number 3 is simple or multi-layered. I want to talk a little bit more about this, as I think this is the question that you need to ask yourself when you are at a given location. And answering this simple question can be the difference between walking away from a location with a banger or a totally disappointing result. Sometimes less is more, and sometimes more is perfection. The choice is up to you. You are in charge. So here are a few examples of me asking myself this question: which one of these will give me the most impactful result? When I visited the Dolomites last year, I knew I wanted to photograph the iconic mountain called Civetta. And the view was so amazing that I immediately decided that this should be a simple shot. I knew that the sun rays would come in through the valley to the west. Some people might say that this looks a little bit flat, but to me, the light and the whole atmosphere and the mountain itself, which is of course the focal point here, is more than enough to make a strong composition. Another insanely iconic location is this remote canyon in Iceland. You can go back to this video if you want to see how I made some drone photography at this location, but this one is shot on my DSLR. After walking around at this beautiful location for half an hour, I decided that I didn't need a foreground for this shot, because the river is already creating such a beautiful leading line through the canyon, and all the natural features here are more than enough to create a stunning photograph. So I decided to go really simple in this one too. So now we've seen 2 examples of going very simple. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more how you can have a more multi-layered approach to your landscape photography. These low-hanging clouds that just magically formed in the valley during the evening made me want to try out a night photography shot here. Looking at this photograph now, you might wonder, but how did you do night photography with a 4.0 lens like the 16-35 is? And the answer is that this is not shot with that lens. This is shot with a prime lens at 20mm 1.8. And what I especially like about this photo is that all areas of the photo is filled with information, except for maybe the bottom right corner where it's a little black. But you have the lit up trees from the tunnel that creates this little bit otherworldly atmosphere, and you have the valley floor, and you have the stars in the sky, and you have El Capitan on your left, and you have the waterfall on the right, and in the far back you can actually see Half Dome. You can just let your eyes wander around in this photo and look at different things. And I really love when the landscape is laid out so beautiful as it is here in the Yosemite Valley, that you can just capture something so natural and so stunning like this. It seems like this video is full of epic locations, and this is for sure another one. In Iceland, it's Kirkjufell mountain, and this is simply a location that is again so full of elements and so grand that you need to be able to go really wide to be able to capture it all. 16mm is also good for this location, but you definitely don't want to come here and only have like a 24mm. I actually ended up going for this composition where I didn't include too much foreground. I was actually supposed to travel to Iceland in a few days, but because of the pandemic, that workshop has been postponed. But when I get there, hopefully soon, I will get to this location and I will talk with my participants about how we can make an even better photo here than this one by working more with foreground. All right, we are getting there. Tip number 4 is enhance your storytelling with human scale. In travel, adventure and landscape photography, adding a person to the photo sometimes leads to a much more impactful result. This also has the benefit of creating a sense of scale, a very important element for the viewer to understand just how grand a landscape actually is. And that's how storytelling is introduced into your photography. So let's have a look at how you can make such photos. I don't know what is with this video, but it seems like all the epic locations I've ever visited is included in this video. Here I'm at Chicheda 2500 in the Dolomites. And of course you can take a photo without a person here and it will be a beautiful photo. But I think the photo benefits from me being in the shot because it adds a sense of scale and it gives the viewer a very clear idea of how it must be to be there and hike in this area. This is a photo I shot just a month ago here in Bali. If you take the person out of this photo, there's almost not any photo to be had. So adding a person here can be the whole difference between a banger photo or not a photo at all, because the light race itself is not a focal point. So if you took out the person, then your eyes would wander around and ask you the question, why am I looking at this? But by adding the person, it's very clear that, oh man, I want to be there. I can see myself standing there in this beautiful light. I included this photo from Iceland just to talk a little bit about the distance the person has to the camera is important, because how do you see this? Is this a landscape photo with a person in, or is this a photo of a person with the landscape as a backdrop? This is just something you need to take into consideration when you're placing a person in your landscape photography. Because if the person in this photo had been just as close to the camera as I was in the previous shot, I would take up too much space in the frame and thereby be competing for the viewer's attention, and this is exactly what you want to avoid when placing a person in a shot with an already very clear focal point. In this case, I think the person adds to the overall composition instead of overtaking the focal point. Then it would probably be better to just have the waterfall alone. And why not end with a photograph that includes all 4 tips? I included a very clear focal point, and I also included foreground, but in a little bit different way here by framing these 2 rocks and creating a leading line that creates depth into the photo. And it's a very multi-layered photograph with many things to look at. And I enhanced the storytelling with placing a person for human scale. So this is a photograph that has performed extremely well on Instagram, for example, but it also makes it very easy for anyone who looks at this photo to put themselves in the position of this person in the photo, thinking, I would love to stand here one day and watch this beautiful sunset. So that is gonna wrap up this video. I hope it helped you to better understand the many possibilities you have using a wide angle lens. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments below. Since photographic field trips is not possible in Bali at the moment, I have some very exciting tutorials coming your way, and I'm very stoked about that. So make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my future videos. Remember to stay creative and stay safe, and thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.